All right, so let's go to your decks and let's take a look at one of your decks that you're more comfortable with that you think is like pretty well optimized, just so I can see
I think this is probably my best
what
in
we're
terms of
looking
deck
at.
building.
Okay,
This is
so
a no interaction
it
deck
looks
that
like a
I
no interactions deck, yeah.
yeah.
Okay, nice, nice. And you're running Arcanon General in this. That's not one
Yeah.
I often see in this deck. It's got a little bit of last will elements. Okay, cool.
It hits files and lumberjack, and every once in a while I'll get Salahar Rider, but
Yeah, yeah, it's got 9 last will effects plus any last will effects that they might have. So I honestly don't think
yep.
it's a bad unit either. Like a 4/6 for 6 gold at
Yeah,
worst
the
case
four
scenario.
six stat is great.
Yeah, not not too bad. Okay, so why? What makes this a good deck in your opinion? Like, what's
I
the
think it's good trading. Using cards like Priest or just Flamestorm value. I mean, mostly getting card draw through like Tari's Files or Arcana General, and then using those cards effectively with cards like Priest to and Drain Life to trade into my opponent's units better and just have a more demanding board state.
right? So it's just like outvalue and then come out
That
ahead.
value.
In the late game, you've got healing, whereas they might not. You've got
Yep.
enough burn. So yeah, that's its strength in gameplay for sure. And in terms of weaknesses, have you played it enough to
I
like mentally note down what its weaknesses are?
I'm not quite sure.
So
I have
like
a bunch of, but I'm not quite sure like what the weakness is.
yeah, so when you enter a match, you're like kind of thinking it's gonna go pretty well overall, but you're
Yeah.
a next step might be like, okay, looking at the opponent's colors, what do I see from that? What can I learn before the game even starts? And
Well, like so something that I'll do is if I see my opponent's running pirate, I'll try and mulligan harder to get bolt or hobble.
right,
Like
yeah,
that's something I'll do. But
yeah. So you're doing that already. Okay, and then do you have like a newer deck that
I mean,
you
I
haven't
actually
like refined
this
quite
is the
as
most
much?
recent deck I just made. It's not as good as the other one, but
Yeah, yeah. No, that's the point.
it's my
Okay,
first dabble into like a scope deck.
okay. So you've got 2 Phantom Strikes and 3 Scopes.
Yeah, Phantom Strike is I think it's a little underrated just
Yeah,
because like nobody really expects it. I've gotten a ton of just like random value out of nowhere from it on like Fenrir.
for sure. It's got like being a 2 cost card
Yeah,
is it just allows you to play it on the same turn as you play a
yeah.
different
And then
unit, which
I put in some cards like Serpent Witch from suggestion from like I think it was Vicious who told me to run that,
yeah,
which seems smart.
yeah, yeah. With scope, it can be kind of crazy.
Yeah.
So how much have you played this deck so far?
Uh, Play it every once in a while. I find it pretty fun to play, so I play it somewhat often.
Nice. Okay. So the first things I'm looking at in terms of deck building is you've got 6 1 drops. Or when I look at like the curve of a deck,
Yeah.
um, I generally ignore spells for the most part and just look at the units, and then the spells kind of fill in naturally. It doesn't really adhere to the curve of the deck. So as
Okay.
long as you have not just all really expensive or all really cheap spells, then you're going to be good to go.
All right.
So you've got 28 units, which is a pretty decent count. I generally go around 30, but um, I wouldn't go as low as 25. That's unless you've got a spell heavy deck for some reason. Like most decks tend to be around 30, I'd say, as a rule of thumb.
Okay.
And looking at the curve, so you've got 2 full copies of 1 drops, so 6. Only 1 2 drop, but you've got hovel as well.
Yeah.
So that's I don't know, it's kind of an exception because it is a turn two
Elvish,
play, whereas
yeah,
Phantom Strike is not going to be played on turn two.
Elvish Thief feels a little weird in the deck. I mean, it's really nice when you can use the gold to get into like armory or something, but it usually doesn't really do much. What I
Yeah,
found.
but it's just like it's a pretty good stat line too. Right, three
Yeah, that's
two.
that's the big part.
It's yeah, and it trades so well with lumberjacks, which everyone is running against you.
That's true.
So for me, Elvish Thief is an auto include in every
Okay,
pirate deck. It's
I figured it was, or that. So I've heard, but I wanted to make sure.
yeah, yeah. That's I mean, as always, experiment with stuff. Um,
Yeah,
it's you can't always just take it for face value. If you find that something else is working better for you, then I mean, go with what's getting you results.
yeah,
Actually, before I go any further, I should ask. I assume our main goal is to get a higher win rate. Is that right?
yeah.
Because like there are different types of players in the game or in any card game. There's um,
I do
probably
love
the
pulling off like really sick combos, but like
yeah.
winning is definitely something I'm very invested in. I would say.
Okay, yeah, yeah. A lot of people get their fun from winning. That's um, generally
Yeah,
true. There are people who don't care as much about winning, and they just want to pull off like crazy big cards or big combos.
yeah.
And then there are people who like um, don't really care about either of those. They just kind of want to make a deck and have it work once in a while. So they don't care about necessarily having the biggest cards or winning all that often, but having that creativity and doing something that nobody's ever done before can be really fun to them.
One thing that gets stuck on me for this deck is all the 4 drops,
Yeah,
which I'm not quite sure what to do about because it feels like a lot of them are really vital. Because of course you got scope and armory.
yeah.
Like
So I
an
would
odd
say
pot's nice.
Sea Witch I am not a fan of
I'm
personally.
not really either, but like I also really wanted to use Sea Witch. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean with an extra range, it
It can be
becomes
nasty as
more of
well
a
if you get
threat.
a bestial rage on it
Yeah,
and
oh,
have an armory up or something.
it's pretty crazy if it gets going. The problem is if it doesn't get going,
Yeah,
like
it dies so easily.
playing a Sea Witch and then it dies to like a random chain lightning
That's
is
why I think I might be better to like run 2 or something.
yeah. So that was another point I was going to bring up later. Is you can run down a 2 copies versus 3 copies.
Yeah,
What do you know about that already? Like, what can you tell me about why you're
like
choosing 2 copies versus 3 copies of a card?
uh normally because the way I see a card is what is it gonna get me? Like for example, over here we have Fenrir, Valroth, and Mordok. Those are just all kind of my payoffs, but I'm only running 2 Fenrir and 2 Valroth because they both are my big payoffs late game. So I don't see a need to run 3 of one if I already have like 2 of the other.
Yeah. So yeah, obviously, 3 ofs are gonna get you more consistency
Yeah, that's
because,
true.
like, if you have 50 card slots per deck. So if you, which is actually quite high for a card game, I think the standard is around 40.
Hmm.
Um, so it makes consistency like a bit more um, important in this game.
It's also kind of
But
like again, this is like my first like dip into like scope in this stuff,
yeah,
so I
yeah,
don't I like don't know like which one, if there is of like one I should use. I don't know like which one I should go into or not.
right. And so yeah, I'll come back to that in a moment.
Yeah.
But on the 2 of and 3 of thing, like if you include if you could do 4 ofs in a deck, for example,
Yeah.
you would want to do that all 4 ofs to make the most consistent deck.
Yeah.
But obviously we can't do that. It's restricted. So yeah, 3 ofs is the best we can do for consistency. But the reason you would do two ofs or even sometimes one ofs is flexibility. And say like, I don't know, one of the
Like Hands
go-to
of Saint
examples for
or
me.
something.
Yeah, Hands the Saint's a good one. You're like,
Little tech cards.
you see in your mulligan that you're facing, oh, this might be a rush deck, and I see Hands of the Saint as my one of just happens to be in my mulligan options.
Okay,
Maybe
that's
you'll
cool.
keep that, right?
Yeah.
And then say you draw it later on. You know what? It's fine. You know you're not going to draw more of them because there's only one in your deck. Same with like, sometimes people include a one of Burning Sun, where it's like, you know what? Sometimes it's a dead card, but sometimes it'll completely turn the game around in your favor.
Okay.
So that's generally the one ofs versus three ofs. Two ofs are kind of in between, obviously, where it's like, oh, I want to see this sometimes, but I would hate to have three of them in my deck, drawn one after another. Does that kind of make any sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, like, um, yeah, and then back to your point about, um, what was it? A lot of, no, what was your previous one? You're
The
saying
one
some,
where I'm like, I have Fenrir and Violoth, and I don't know like if one is better than the other or.
right? Okay, yeah. And you were talking about the same thing, like the four cost units and how do you
Oh yeah, that as
choose
well.
that. And so my stance on that is the the first time you make a deck, it's like really good to make your best guesses at, okay, I've got this curve, it seems pretty good. I've got generally some spells that interact well with the units I've put in. But ultimately, that's not the end of the deck creation. You have to go back and refine the deck every time you play a couple more games. And the more you're thinking about the deck building, like even while the game is going on, the better your refining will be. And that's where it really matters, is going back to the deck after you've played a game and refining it. So maybe you play a game and you find yourself with like, I don't know, 3 Serpent Witches in hand. And you're like, oh man, I have 2 damage. And it's nice that it's a stun, but like I'm not able to deal with swarm decks because I can only attack 1 unit with each of these witches. And you find that they're kind of slowing down your deck. Well, then you drop it down to 2 copies of it. Or maybe you've got something else that, oh, I lost to, I don't know, some sort of thing. So you go back into the deck building and a card that you didn't include, maybe now you include 1 copy of that and adjust things just a little bit at a time. But yeah, I really believe the deck refining matters more than the deck building.
One thing as well, I'm always kind of wondering because, of course, some decks like War Party, for example, are going to be running books and divine knowledge and just drawing lots of cards because that's what War Party does. But if you're in a deck like this or some sort of mid-range deck, like basically, I'm asking how much draw do you usually want to put in a deck?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that goes back to the curve actually. So
Okay.
I if you, I mean, let's do a hypothetical matchup where there's um, one person who's got the late game completely locked, and like they're running some really, I don't know, they've got Ragnar and Sheep to the Slaughter, which is like an insane late game combo. Because you do, it's basically like a Yarum Giant, but instead of 2 chain
Yeah.
lightning, it does 5 chain lightning. It's like, if you can hit multiple units with that, it's basically game over. And,
Mhm.
but they have to get there, obviously. And maybe they've got a bunch of late game cards, so they can really win the late game. But the player who's got more of an early or mid-game strength can just end the game before they get to that point. So what we take away from that is that the lower your curve, the more you're going to gain in tempo as the game progresses. Like your generally lower cost units are going to outvalue the higher cost units in trades. But it comes at a cost of like, if my 2 4-drops can outvalue your 9-drop or something like that, right? Or sometimes you could kill a Yarum Giant with like just 2 3-drops, or a Blacksmith and a Rat King, or I don't know, something like that. And you can outvalue in terms of money, but you're losing based on number of cards played, and soon your deck will run out of gas. And so the ways to counter that are 2 options. You can either raise your curve so that you've got more expensive cards to like continue being able to play similar amounts of power as the game goes on to the later stages, or you can add card draw so that you can continue having cards in your hand. And then all of that put together kind of the one you choose depends on what factions you're running. Like, does it have good card draw options? Obviously, Crusaders has good card draw options, whereas, I don't know, Pirates doesn't have such great options.
Yeah.
You've basically got Onslaught and...
I think Beast is the worst example of no card draw.
Yeah, Beast has Call for Aid, which creates
That's
cards.
true.
So it's like not really drawing cards, but it does the same thing. Yeah,
I
but
feel like Call for Aid might actually be a good card to run here, especially because there's no 5 or 6 drops in the deck.
Call for Aid is really good for like pseudo
I
card
have
draw.
Call for Aid though.
yeah, that's another thing. It's a legendary.
No, I don't.
Oh well. When you get them, you can throw it in.
Let's craft one for now.
One of my
But anyway,
favorites in that respect is for Warlocks. They have okay card draw, but I always forget this guy's name. It's the Keeper of the Shield. Is that what it's called? 5-drop. Keeper of the Doorway. Keeper of the Doorway.
yeah,
That's
keep
what
it
it's
away.
called. I think the amount of card draw that guy provides, generally you can get at least 2 card draw off of a 5 cost unit. So it's like the same amount of card draw as Call for Aid, except that instead of just being a spell that you lose tempo on that turn, you get to play a unit at the same time.
But it's also worth noting that the undead you get from Keeper might be worse than the cards you get from Call for Aid, unless you have like Necromancers.
Definitely, it's always worse than...
Yeah.
Because, I mean, 5-cost Rangers are pretty insane.
Yeah.
But it kind of keeps the tempo. I don't know. I'm a big fan of that card. It allows you to curve your deck a little bit lower, and
I guess that's part of where I'm limited, because when I look at that card, I see like just a kind of low damage unit that will get you some cards and die.
Yeah.
I think that's what I need to start thinking about more.
Yeah, so some keywords that I tend to look up. I know there are like... it's kind of tricky. You can't just search like, I want this type of card, and it comes up. You have to search keywords. So create and add and draw are all sometimes show up. Create, I don't know if it has too many, but oh no, sorry. Create is a different card game. I'm mixing that up. This time,
I think Shaman's another example of a little bit how I view Keeper. I mean, but with Shaman, I've actually got some pretty good success in some other decks.
Yeah, Shaman's a bit controversial. I don't love Shaman, but
yeah.
I know it's okay.
I mean, I feel like if you have an armory down though, it gets ridiculous. But besides
Yeah.
for that,
I
eh.
mean, the reason I don't like Shaman so much is because, in terms of the unit itself, it's a 2/4
Yeah,
with. So it's basically a Faithful Drake, but it doesn't have flying. And so knowing that Faithful Drake is a 2-cost card, it's now the 2 gold left over that you're spending on Shaman is basically it's a 2 gold draw a card.
that's a good way to put it.
And it's fine. Like 2 gold draw a card in a color combo with not too much card draw is kind of nice. But if you have other options, I generally go for other options first.
Okay.
Yeah, that's I don't know. Some people like it a lot more than I do, obviously.
Yeah, I end up running it a little less than I think other people would.
Yeah. I like Onslaught better than Shaman
I
in
like Onslaught a lot. I
pirate
think
decks.
it's great. Cool.
It's so good for dealing with ranged units.
Yep, 100%. Or just like blacksmith or fat bard if you need to.
Yeah, yeah, it's so true. Um, so let's see, what do I have that I could look at that's kind of similar to your deck? Um, Here, let me. How do I do this? I guess I stream as well. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
I think I'm looking at it. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah.
that doesn't work. Okay, um, so it's kind of a similar deck. This is. It's not working so well with my recording, but um,
And you definitely have a lot higher curve.
it's a lot higher curve, but I also have a bit more treasure generation, which is why I
Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
which is when I why I adjusted the curve to be higher. Like
What
I
kind of
as I
you
played
have
this
draw?
deck, yeah, don't think I have too much
Okay.
draw. Like I've got 3 copies Call for Aid, so that's my draw there.
Oh yeah, that seems to work really well with Robins.
And then Robins into these high cost units, and
I
uh,
started out like scope Robins, but I didn't really have many payoffs for it. But now that I'm running Call for Aid, it might be worth considering.
yeah, also Southport Captain, I even dropped him down to 2 copies because it was still I was still running out of cards before I was able to finish out the game.
Mm-hmm.
But this is sort of a deck I've optimized maybe a bit more than yours. And
Yeah.
that's all it takes is like play around with it for a bit, try different things. If you um, realize, hey, I'm losing against this matchup, what could I have done to improve it? Or I even advocate for, I won this matchup, but I noticed that there was a card that was sitting in my hand for the entirety of the game, and I never got to play it. It's kind of a dead card.
Okay.
Can I adjust based on that?
But
So
sometimes that's like okay though. Like
sometimes it's
sometimes
okay,
you'll
obviously, yeah. If it's like, oh, maybe it's just not useful in this matchup, but in other matchups,
yeah
it's the best card. Yeah,
some like for like specific example, I remember going through a game where I started with like 2 fears in hand, and I just kept them the whole game, and I
yeah.
still won.
Oh yeah, Führer is definitely auto include. Like,
And it's like, yeah, it didn't do anything. But the thing is, if my opponent had like gotten into a better board set, I would have had tools to deal with it.
yeah. And back to the Shaman example. Shaman is like paying 2 gold for card draw.
Yeah,
Fear is paying 1 gold for card draw, and you get the Fear effect, which like
it can be pretty good.
it's pretty awesome. Yeah. That's why Lumberjack is a auto include as well. It's
Yep,
in other games I don't know if it's as common here, but they call it a cantrip.
yep.
Uh,
I cantrips are great.
Yeah,
That
just auto include all of those.
Just cycle your deck, get to the cards you need.
Yep. All right, so I'm gonna switch back to yours.
Yep.
Um, so we've kind of answered deck curve, the initial theory crafting of a deck, and adjusting it as you go. Um, you wanted to know about some matchups.
Yeah, I think the one that I'm the most interested in is like rats.
Rats. So, like, how to deal with it.
Yeah, just kind of like what deals with rats and like when, because like I don't know if I should define rats as a mid game deck or like how should I define it?
Um, yeah, I say swarm, but I don't know if that's a common thing people say. You could go mid game. You could call it tempo. It's kind of tricky because in this game, the way that you position it changes the way that you classify the deck a lot.
Okay, that's interesting.
So I don't know. Different players play the deck in different styles. But generally, the
Okay,
things that deal with rats and swarm decks are you deal with the threats. So um, the threats in that deck are the global buffs and the hovels. Um, Rat King is a little bit trickier, but we'll come back to him in a second.
that king can be kind of hard to deal with if it's like mystic rats because they can just
Yeah,
pop that out at any time.
Mystic Rats is overtuned, but it's not like we're going to get a balance patch for it.
Yeah,
I mean, if we were still getting balance patches, I imagine that would be nerfed. I think,
yeah.
yeah, Mystic Journey at 2 gold is kind of insane.
I mean, even with like Leanna and stuff, it's
But even still, like, if you're able to deal with all of the globals as they come out, a Rat King Mystic Journey is like they're
not that
paying
bad.
they're paying 5 gold and they run at you with a bunch of 1/1s. And you're like, yeah, that was like still strong, but I'm able to deal with it.
Especially if you're running like Vikings or Warlock
Yeah,
or like
exactly. So
Wardock. Great.
there are two ways to deal with decks. The first one is your matchup, where once the game is started, you can't control that. You can only kind of plan ahead. So generally, I advise that like the best decks should include at least one of Vikings, uh, Warlocks, or Druids. And I mean, there are exceptions to that rule, big time exceptions. But if you're just making a good stuff deck,
Yeah.
Warlocks,
Okay.
Vikings, or Druids are all the best at dealing with buildings. Um,
Can I ask, like, obviously in Warlock you have your power cards like Darkbender or Fear, and in Druid you have like Call for Aid and yeah, but like what are the like power cards in Viking that make it good?
um, so Lightning Blade is the first one that comes to mind. Um, it's really the chain lightning potential. If you're running,
Like Temple?
yeah, Temple and my Lightning Blade, that's the name of it, right?
Yeah.
Um, it those, I mean, the common spots for yeah, Lightning Blade. The common spots for people to put buildings are um, on the back line
Yeah.
generally, and so if it's touching their castle, Lightning Blade is awesome
It
for that.
definitely it definitely feels like though if you're fighting in like higher ranks that people will obviously put their buildings in the corner or hovel in the hovel spot. Like that kind
Yeah,
of stuff is good.
and so if you're running a deck where Viking is your main um, removal tool for buildings, what you can do is you include flying units. And so you say, okay, either
Okay.
you have to position your unit to block my flying guy where I'll just fly over your unit and hit your building, or you have to position right in front of your building where I'll just use my lightning blade and destroy it anyway.
Okay, I see that.
And it kind of pushes them into a no-win situation as long as you can be the aggressor in the game. Like if
Yeah,
they're up on units and you have no board presence, then that whole strategy falls kind of flat.
yeah.
Um, there are a few things that
Oh, and of course, like
Vikings have.
I
Yeah,
got Cloak of Ice and
Cloak
Pillar
of
are
Ice and
pretty important.
Pillar is set up for those sorts of mass building destructions the same way. And Sheep to the Slaughter is an underrated tool.
Yeah, I remember using Shoot to the Slaughter a long time ago, and it was performing better than I thought it would.
Yeah, especially like, do you know the trick where you position your unit in front of an enemy unit before using Sheep to the Slaughter, so that, oh, maybe I don't want that particular unit to be pulled forward. And so
I've been
it's,
playing around with Drake Dance a bit, so
yeah,
I get that.
Drake Dance has the same kind of thought process. So yeah, so there are all sorts of little things you can do. But yeah, those three again are Vikings. It's got some tools. They're a little bit harder to play, but I mean, you get used to them.
Yeah, it's
Warlocks
not like
obviously
Warlock
have
where you just drop a
burn.
Darkbender.
Yeah, you're just like, oh, here's my Darkbender. Here's my Wizard. You often play those together. Or like, oh,
Yeah,
here's a blue
okay.
firebolt on your armory. What are you gonna do now?
So it's more planning
It's
in
a bit
Vikings.
more planning ahead in Vikings, and then Druids have the companions to deal with buildings,
Yeah,
which is like, oh, you dropped a four gold armory. Here's my 4 gold. What's he called?
Centaur.
Centaur, and the centaur. Um, so you got paid the same amount of money, but now you have a 3/3 on the board, and they don't.
On their face specifically.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's why centaur
Yeah,
is such a strong card.
yeah. It feels like Spiny definitely gets overshadowed because you're not really going to be killing much for two.
Yeah, Spiny's only good if you're running a lot of globals in the deck as well.
If you can get it up to 3 attack, then it's pretty
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, if you're running like 3 copies of blacksmith, 3 copies of armory, then Spiny becomes almost as good.
Yeah.
The other ones though, like ninjas, have almost no way to deal with uh, a building set way at the back.
Yeah.
They've got
I mean, they can do
a
some
little
like
bit of
movement
movement
stuff,
speed.
but
They can temporarily
usually won't
dissipate
make it.
it back into the enemy's hand,
They
but
can use stealth sometimes to get there.
they have things, but they're not as reliable. That's
No,
the
that's right.
that's the thing. So
Stealthing one of your units can just get killed by a D-fire
when
and
you're
not matter.
playing Vikings, you generally have to be um, the more proactive deck. Like instead of trying to respond to your enemy's threats, you have to make threats for them to respond to.
So, explain to me. So, I believe that no interactions was developed as a kind of counter to rats at first. Is
Yeah,
that correct?
yeah,
So, how in what way does it counter rats besides just like, of course, flamestorm and D-fire to get rid of rats?
yeah. So I mean, there's getting rid of the rats themselves, but it's really more about getting rid of uh, the rat hovels because, well, I mean, if they're not generating them, then their deck is a lot weaker, and the globals because, like we said earlier, dropping a bunch of 1/1s is not as big of a threat, and rats have to combo stuff together in order to make it strong. You just like
So, okay,
remove one of their combo pieces.
so no
There,
interaction basically just runs enough answers to deal with rats, and then enough cards to synergize well enough to just beat rats in terms of just raw value.
right. And the other things it does really well is the heal. So
Yeah.
like, oh, we've gotten to late game. Once you're in the late game, if the rat player still doesn't have some sort of a presence on board with global buffs, then they're no stronger in the late game than they would have been in the early game.
Okay.
And so you just out heal them, and you can win by what do you call it? The timer ticking down.
How important are like holes in curve? Because like for example, in the scope one, I didn't have like any six drops. Is it worth like running a semi good six drop
Uh,
just to fill that slot, or
no, for I mean, it depends on the number. For like, if you're not
definitely
running
depends?
any two drops, yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah,
If you're not running any six drops, not such a big deal, because by that point in the game, I mean, this is again, it's theory crafting, so we can't expect it to actually play out this time. But if you're playing the max amount of gold every turn, maybe you'll play on the 6 gold turn, you'll play
yeah,
a 4 cost unit and a 2 cost spell, something like that.
yeah.
You don't actually need to play like the exact cost every turn.
Okay.
If you find that it helps to have it, like you can also just try stuff and see what comes up. Um, you're if you're trying like, oh, I'll play 2 copies of Southport Cannoneer, and then you try it and you say, oh, did it work better than before, or is it worse than before?
Okay.
And then
So
you just
it's a lot of
adjust.
experimenting.
Yeah, it really is, and that's why like you look at a lot of the top players, especially like Yoda and Oziek, who like may not have been top players initially, but they are definitely top players just based on their amount of experience. If they're in a situation, um, they've probably been in that situation before, and they just think like, how did I deal with that? Did it work? And what can I change? And they go back and optimize their decks, and just through sheer experience of playing thousands of games,
There's
they
also like
know
there's
what to do.
somewhat like adapting to the meta as well.
Yeah, the meta
Something.
changes a bit. So you said no interactions counters rats. Do you know what counters no interactions?
No, I don't think we. I don't think I really got when we touched on that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, okay. So generally it's big health units.
That
So
makes sense.
um, if you can't, if you go back to your no interactions deck for a moment,
Yeah. I
um,
mean, like for one example, I noticed that like it's really hard to deal with an enemy's Dark Bender
yeah, yeah,
because 5 health is so obnoxious because you can't kill with Bolt. You don't. Nothing gets it reliably.
yeah. Well, that's what makes it such a strong card too. But
Yeah.
like, if I'm, it's okay. My fire alarm's going off. Um, so yeah, if I've got um, if I've got a deck going up against this no interactions deck, it's okay, and I want to counter it, I just put in high health units. And what tools do you have that can deal with that?
Yeah.
Like you can try and outburn it. You can try and draw multiple dragon's fires and flame storms and whatever. But if I play Call for Aid, and I
Yeah.
mean,
Call for Aid's
you
a
might have
beating in this.
seen you might have seen it happen before, where somebody plays on turn 4 call for or coin into Call for Aid, and then on
Yep.
turn 5 they drop a ranger, on turn 6 another ranger. And
It's
like,
so hard to
there's
deal with that. There's
absolutely
not much.
nothing in this deck that can deal with that.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's the biggest counter I've found to dealing with no interactions, is just like play good stuff in high health units. Don't try and do any fancy combos, just good units on their own.
Okay. So this is so no interactions is kind of a targeted removal deck to pick apart your opponent's combo.
Yeah. And then what counters high health units and good units is generally combo decks that,
Yeah,
while they might not
and
have as good value on,
something like this, or
yeah, sure, they might not have as good value, um, one unit versus one unit, but if I apply in this deck, say, Dwarven Scope onto a Fenrir, well, I just traded like way in my favor, got tons of
you, know, you
value.
you get 2 units and retreat Fenrir back to safety. Like,
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. So if you can use combos to outvalue
and if they're running
cards that are
like
good on
all
their
these
own,
high health units, if they're running all the high health units, they probably don't have tools to really deal with like Fenrir stuff. They probably won't have like a mercenary execution or something.
yeah, it, I mean it depends on the player, depends on the deck.
Yeah,
Obviously, you can't assume it, but
yeah.
man, Fenrir used to be insane. I don't know if you played back then, but
I played like years ago, back in
okay, yeah, like maybe
yeah.
3 years ago ish. Fenrir was 5 cost and started with 3 attack,
I
but
think I remember those days. Yeah,
the time to go from 3 attack to 5 attack in Fenrir is almost nothing. But a
it's not long.
2 gold reduction is such a big difference. And so you would
Yeah,
see Fenrir and Scope played on the same turn on turn 9, and it was
yeah. That's something I've also noticed about this is like sometimes you can use like Elvish Thief as well to get that treasure to run to go just fire off Dwarven Scope out of nowhere or something like that.
right. And that's what my um, the deck I showed you that was similar to this one.
That
Um,
what Southport Captain's kind of for as well.
yeah, it was actually created back in those days. Like it's one of my oldest decks that I've got, and it would run the 5 cost Fenrir back in the day with Scope, and it was just like very much the meta deck at the time. Uh, the only downside from that meta deck was that it ran so many legendaries, and
Yeah.
I, from my refining, I've decided that Fenrir generally isn't enough power um, for that late stage in the game, so I've kind of taken him out over time. Um,
Because usually you can get enough payout from just Rangers or
well, yeah,
Rock or something.
the thing, especially not just Fenrir, but like almost all late game units, is by the time it gets to that stage where you're able to play the Fenrir Scope combo, for example, you might already be winning the game. In which case, like it didn't help you; it's just helping you win more, and that's kind
Yeah,
kind of
that's something I gotta
useless.
think about more as well.
It would be better to have another early game card to make sure you can get to the late game to begin with. Or the other thing is like, is it a card that's going to help you come back if you're in the losing position, in the opposite situation?
That's
And so
yeah, that's definitely
it
something that I was thinking about.
it can help you come back in rare cases, but
Okay.
not not always. It's not the best defensive card.
Yeah, it's I can't remember the example, but I remember I was thinking about this earlier and about how hey, this card combos really well with this card if I have this card. But I mean, like once I already have those 2 cards, I'm probably winning anyway. So what's the
Yeah,
point?
yeah. It's there's a resource I'll have to find it again later. I don't think I'm gonna be able to find it right away, but maybe I can. I'm looking right now. Okay, here. It's called Quadrant Theory, and I will just stream it so you can see. So you're familiar with Magic the Gathering, I imagine.
Yeah, mostly a commander player.
I don't I never actually played it. I just know the game a little bit
Okay.
from um, over time. You hear things because it's kind of the original. Um, but like there are so many resources out there about different theories and stages of the game, which are really interesting to read, I find. So this is the quadrant theory. It's saying if you it asks you to think about how a card performs in 4 different stages of the game, or quadrants. Their development, so the early turns when you're playing cards out of your opening hand, you're looking for cards that will affect the game and don't cost too much mana. Parity, when no player has a specific advantage, usually because neither player can attack, you're kind of in like a stalemate where you're both developing. And you're drawing off the top of your deck. Winning, so I mean, you're at an advantageous board state, or losing, it's the opposite. And so if we look at something like Fenrir, in development, well, you can't play it, it's too expensive. For an equal situation, that's when it performs best, because you're able to develop it, and then the next turn play your scope or something and get the insane value. But it needs kind of two turns to get that value. I don't know why this page keeps refreshing.
It can
Anyway,
sometimes have value in winning as well.
it sometimes has value in winning, yep, because
Just smacking
say
your
you,
opponent's castle for like
yeah, if you
17.
haven't been able to deal with their castle all game, and so it's still at 20, but then suddenly you have a 20 health or 20 attack Fenrir, bam, you can pull out a big turnaround win. Or sorry, not a turnaround win. In the case that you're already winning, you come out with a big like I'm gonna win before you can pull out your healing cards or something like that. But in the losing situation, it's not so great. 7 gold to develop a unit that can take out one cheaper unit and one more expensive unit. Usually not enough if you're losing.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's a lot to think about every card in this situation, or in these situations. But if you're questioning one card in particular, it's great. So something like Darkbender, if we look at it, development, great. If we're on turn 4, you play a Darkbender, that gives you board presence immediately. They can't rush in and attack you. A parity, it's great because it'll help tilt things towards your advantage, because you've got you're going to outvalue the trades, hopefully. Just a moment. And then if you're winning, it's pretty good because you can deal 4 to face or kind of protect your other units. And if you're losing, not as good, because it takes 2 turns to be able to attack. But if you can safely position it where it's not going to get hit on the first turn, it's not bad in losing either.
All right.
So it gets pretty strong pretty quick. And yeah, the other one, I don't know if you've seen it. This one is the tier list that I made a long time ago. With Crate Brick, and it's just got like all the factions at the bottom. You click on one that you like, and then it tells you what
That's cool.
the cards are generally rated. Now the downside of this is that cards aren't normally put into one specific deck, right? Like for example, War Party is a C tier card. Not because the War Party archetype is bad, but it's just because War Party only fits into one type of deck.
Mm-hmm.
And so we kind of listed that on the opening page. It's like S tier is auto include or near auto include in every deck with that faction. It's the best generalized cards. A tier is cards that fit into a variety of different meta decks. They work overall. B is decent. They fit into some meta decks. So, I don't know if it fits into a couple archetypes, or it's a decent overall card. It's B tier. C tier it's like it only fits into one specific archetype, or it's just a fun card to go into a bunch of off meta decks. D tier,
Okay.
that's when you get bad cards. But yeah, it's important to remember this one. Oh, my stream keeps closing down on me. The tiers are based on how many decks a cards fit in, not necessarily how powerful a card is in any specific deck. But yeah,
Okay.
I'll send you this list because it's super useful when you're deck building.
Yeah, that would be cool. This looks really nice.
It's a bit outdated in terms of the meta, but still pretty good. Are there other questions that you got?
I think that's like all the big things I really wanted to get thoughts about.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really go into gameplay, but you said you're mostly comfortable
Feel
with
pretty
your...
good about my gameplay. I think I still make mistakes, but I think I am recognizing my mistakes about what I want
Yeah,
to do.
and you're able to see them on your own and kind of adjust for the next game.
Yeah.
But yeah, biggest takeaway I'd say is remember that deck building is important for the first time you build your deck, but more important is refining it afterwards when you're playing those first 10 games maybe and beyond. Of course, the deck building process never stops.
Okay, that's good to think about. I sometimes I'll build a new deck and then it won't perform well, and then I'll just feel discouraged and kind of give up. So
Yeah, I mean, if it's really not working, then it might be
yeah,
worthwhile to start over. But I mean, hopefully you've got some success with it, and you can kind of
yeah.
shift your deck to work towards those successes.
Okay.
But yeah, that's the big one. Then um, just be aware of the matchups a bit more. It always helps to if you're finding one matchup really tricky, go build that deck as best you can and play it, and you'll understand it a lot faster than just playing against it.
Okay.
If you play as it, you'll realize when you lose a game, oh, that's what this deck's weaknesses are.
Yeah, I've definitely started noticing that with some things like the blue yellow, the Mystic Rat blue yellow stuff. It's like wow, sometimes I just don't have globals and I can't do anything.
Right. Yeah, that's what I would advise.
And then like once, but of course playing this, like I also realize like even if all my globals are dead, sometimes I could just get like a really big reanimate value card off and still get some headway.
Hmm.
So it's like if you're in that position against that kind of colors and they don't have their globals up, you gotta still look out for that.
Right. Yeah, reanimate is one of those cards where it's like um, it can be really surprising.
Yeah.
People see a stalemate and they go into rushing forward thinking they have the advantage. You trade in, maybe they did have the advantage based on what they can see, but okay, you took a few undervalued trades, but then you get a huge value based off of spawning undead units.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, oh, and the other thing that we touched on to remember is the two ways to counter different matchups they're having, which are you can pick a different deck and counter pick it, or the other one was you can try and position around it, which we didn't get into as much, but
Yeah, that's something we kind of missed. But
that's more
that's
of in a gameplay situation. We would have covered that more. You can try and position around things, and I don't know. Vikings are notoriously a bit hard to position around, and takes a
yeah.
lot of practice to figure out what you're actually supposed to do against them.
There's also niche things I've noticed, like Dragon Knight, how it spawns the unit at the bottom or at the top, so you can't put a unit like 3 away from that spot.
Yeah,
You don't want to get hit by that.
yeah, definitely a lot of things to consider. But I think I'm gonna end it there.